The morning of March 18, 1943, somewhere over the Belgian countryside, Second Lieutenant Robert Abb crouches in the plexiglass nose of a B-17 flying fortress, his gloved hands adjusting a device that weighs 65 pounds but supposedly contains America's entire strategic air doctrine. The Norden bombsight. Through his oxygen mask, words crackle over the intercom in short, clipped bursts. Target ahead, about 15 degrees left, maybe 6 miles. His breath fogs the telescope eyepiece, despite the electrically heated blanket wrapped around the bombsight's delicate mechanisms. Outside, the temperature hovers at 40 below zero. Abb's mission brief that morning contained 3 critical pieces of information. The Schiess Defries machine tool works at Düsseldorf, altitude 21,000 feet, and the promise that with this device in front of him, carefully installed under armed guard just hours earlier, he could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from precisely that height. He's heard the speeches. Read the company's Latin motto, loosely translated as, "When better pickle barrels are built, Norden will hit them too." 6 months ago, during bombardier training, he stood before an officer and swore an oath, a formal, solemn promise that if his aircraft went down behind enemy lines, he would destroy this machine with his life if necessary. First with his pistol. If that failed, with a thermite grenade designed to melt 2,000 precision components into a useless lump of slag. The problem right now isn't German fighters or flak, though both are coming. The problem is that Abb can't actually see a pickle barrel from 21,000 feet. He can barely make out the factory complex through intermittent cloud cover and industrial haze. The crosshairs etched into his telescope lens, those hairline marks that supposedly enable pinpoint accuracy, currently obscure an area on the ground roughly 300 feet across. A pickle barrel measures maybe 2 feet in diameter. The mathematics don't work, but Abb's job isn't questioning mathematics. His job is keeping that factory centered in his sight, making continuous corrections with 2 control wheels, and trusting that the analog computer humming beneath his hands is solving equations no human could process consciously. Wind speed, wind direction, aircraft ground speed, altitude, air density, the ballistic coefficient of 500-pound bombs, all calculated by rotating shafts, meshing gears, and gyroscopes spinning at 7,200 revolutions per minute. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What Abb doesn't know, what none of the 50,000 American bombardiers trained on the Norden know, is that the Germans obtained complete technical details of this top-secret device 5 years ago. A spy named Hermann Lang, employed at the Carl L. Norden Company, memorized the plans during a visit to Germany in 1938 and reconstructed them from memory for German military intelligence. They paid him $1,500. The whole elaborate security apparatus, the armed guards, the bomb vaults, the theatrical oaths, the classification markings, all of it rendered meaningless before the first B-17 ever crossed the English Channel. But that irony pales compared to the deeper truth that will only become statistically undeniable after thousands of missions. In testing, under ideal conditions with no enemy interference, the Norden demonstrated a circular error probable of 75 feet, meaning half of all bombs dropped should land within a 75-foot radius of the aiming point. Revolutionary performance for 1941. Under combat conditions over Europe in 1943, the Norden's average circular error probable sits at 1,200 feet, 16 times worse than testing promised. Only 16% of bombs dropped fall within 1,000 feet of where bombardiers aimed them. America entered this war betting its entire strategic bombing doctrine on precision, on the belief that daylight raids against specific industrial targets would cripple Germany's war machine without resorting to the British tactic of nighttime area bombing against cities. The Norden bombsight was supposed to make that precision possible. It consumed $1.1 billion in development and production by war's end. For context, the Manhattan Project, which would eventually produce atomic weapons, cost $2.2 billion. Half the price of splitting the atom went into building 90,000 copies of an analog computer that, in actual combat, couldn't consistently hit a factory from 4 miles up. This isn't a story about a failed technology. The Norden worked exactly as designed. This is a story about the gap between what engineers can achieve under controlled conditions and what war actually demands. About the difference between test range accuracy and being shot at while trying to keep a factory centered in crosshairs through clouds, smoke, and fear. It's about how America's most secret weapon became its most successful propaganda tool, precisely because the truth about its real-world performance remained classified long after the device itself lost its secrecy. To understand how American military planners convinced themselves that a mechanical analog computer could revolutionize warfare from 25,000 feet, you have to go back to the moment when that idea stopped sounding insane. July 21, 1921. Off the coast of Virginia, a formation of Army Air Service bombers led by Brigadier General Billy Mitchell approaches a target that, until recently, represented the pinnacle of naval power. The Ostfriesland, a captured German battleship displacing 27,000 tons of steel. Mitchell's mission: demonstrate that aircraft could sink capital ships from altitude. The Navy's position: firmly skeptical. Battleships were heavily armored, compartmentalized, and designed to survive torpedo hits. Bombs dropped from above would, at worst, damage superstructures. It took 65 bombs to sink the Ostfriesland. Not one, not 5. 65 separate bombing runs before the massive vessel finally rolled over and disappeared beneath the waves. By any reasonable analysis, this demonstrated that sinking ships from aircraft was possible, but wildly inefficient. Mitchell, however, declared victory. The test proved aircraft could destroy the most powerful warships afloat, which technically wasn't wrong. It just required dropping more explosives than most bomber formations could carry. But the psychological impact mattered more than the tactical reality. Naval supremacy, the foundation of military strategy since wooden sailing ships, suddenly looked vulnerable to a completely different threat axis. If aircraft could theoretically sink battleships, what else could they destroy? Factories, power plants, railway hubs? American military theorists at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama developed a doctrine that would define strategic thinking for the next 2 decades. Modern warfare increasingly leveraged a nation's industrial capacity. Destroying an enemy's ability to manufacture tanks, aircraft, and ammunition would cripple their military more effectively than fighting that military directly. This avoided the nightmare of World War I, where armies ground themselves to pieces in trench warfare without decisively defeating each other. Strategic bombing promised a cleaner path to victory. Destroy the industrial base, the military collapses, the war ends. Theory assumed one critical component: precision. You couldn't just drop bombs randomly across Germany and hope to hit war industries. That would kill civilians, destroy residential areas, and might actually strengthen enemy morale through shared suffering. Britain learned this during the Blitz. German bombing of London didn't break British resolve. It hardened it. No, precision meant identifying specific factories, marshalling yards, oil refineries, power plants, and hitting those targets while leaving surrounding areas intact. Humane strategic bombing, if such a thing could exist. But precision bombing from 20,000 feet required solving a problem that had defeated every previous attempt. When you release a bomb from a moving aircraft, that bomb doesn't fall straight down. It inherits the aircraft's forward momentum, creating a trajectory that arcs forward through 3-dimensional space. The distance the bomb travels horizontally depends on altitude, aircraft speed, wind direction, air density, and the bomb's weight and aerodynamic characteristics. Change any variable and the bomb lands in a different spot. In World War I, bombardiers used timing sights, essentially stopwatches and crude aiming devices. They'd calculate ground speed using a clock, factor in altitude from a barometer, consult ballistic tables for the specific bomb type, and attempt to release at the moment those numbers aligned. Accuracy was, generously, terrible. Maybe one bomb in 50 landed within 100 yards of its intended target. By the 1920s, the British had developed the course-setting bombsight, a mechanical calculator that represented the wind triangle as actual physical pieces of metal arranged in a triangular configuration. The bombardier would measure wind direction and speed, set those values on the device, and it would calculate the required flight path. Clever, and better than timing by hand. Still wildly inaccurate above 10,000 feet, the core problem remained leveling. If the aircraft pitched, rolled, or yawed during the bomb run, the bombsight's alignment would shift. Even a 2-degree error in attitude could move the impact point hundreds of feet. Pilots tried flying straight and level, but maintaining perfect stability in a heavy bomber while under enemy fire was effectively impossible. What bombardiers needed was a bombsight that could maintain its own stable reference point, regardless of aircraft movement. Gyroscopes, proven technology for ship stabilization since the early 1900s, could theoretically solve this. Mount the sighting system on a gyroscopically stabilized platform, and it would remain level even as the aircraft maneuvered. The challenge was miniaturizing and refining gyroscope technology enough to fit inside a bomber nose, work reliably at altitude in sub-freezing temperatures, and interface with all the other calculations required for accurate bombing. In January 1920, the United States Navy's Bureau of Ordnance issued a contract to a Dutch immigrant named Carl Lucas Norden to improve their existing bombsight. Norden wasn't inventing from scratch. Gyroscopes existed, mechanical calculators existed, telescopic sights existed. His innovation was integration, taking these separate technologies and combining them into a single system that worked together seamlessly. Born in Semarang, Java, in 1880, Norden studied mechanical engineering at Switzerland's Federal Polytechnic Institute in Zurich. By most accounts, he was brilliant, exacting, and insufferably difficult to work with. Self-centered, impatient, domineering, driven, abrasive, a perfectionist, and of the highest ethical standards. One of his contemporaries called him Old Man Dynamite. His name didn't even appear on the patent for the bombsight he designed, because Norden considered himself a designer rather than an inventor. Only God could invent. Humans merely designed using principles God had created. After immigrating to the United States in 1904, Norden worked for Elmer Sperry developing gyrostabilizers for ships. The partnership lasted exactly 4 years before both men's personalities made continued collaboration impossible. Sperry disliked Norden's appetite for vile black cigars. Norden resented Sperry's proposal that Norden sign over his future patent rights. They parted ways in 1913, though they occasionally collaborated on projects during World War I. By 1920, when the Navy approached Norden about bombsights, he had established himself as a consulting engineer with specialized expertise in gyroscopic systems. His initial work focused on adding gyrostabilization to the Navy's existing Mark III bombsight, a modified British design. Early prototypes showed promise but suffered from persistent problems. The gyroscopes drifted over time, requiring lengthy recalibration procedures. Vibration from aircraft engines caused the mechanisms to malfunction. The pilot direction indicator, a device that showed pilots which direction to turn, worked inconsistently. Testing at the Naval Proving Ground in Dahlgren, Virginia, began in 1922. Results were, diplomatically, disappointing. The circular error probable measured 110 feet from only 3,000 feet altitude. This represented an error rate over 3.5%, actually worse than some existing bombsights. Worse, bombardiers universally complained the device was far too complicated to use. Norden went back to the drawing board. The fundamental insight that would eventually define his successful design came from questioning basic assumptions. Previous bombsights tried to calculate ground speed indirectly by measuring wind and applying vector mathematics. Norden realized you could measure ground speed directly. Mount the sight on a gyroscopically stabilized platform, point a telescope at the ground. As the aircraft moves forward, the ground appears to drift backward in the telescope's field of view. Measure the rate of that drift using a motor that rotates a mirror in the telescope's optical path. The motor speed required to cancel out the apparent drift equals the aircraft's ground speed over the terrain below. Once you know true ground speed, calculating when to drop bombs becomes straightforward trigonometry. By 1927, Norden had a working prototype designated Mark 11. Navy testing showed significant improvement over earlier designs, but problems persisted. The gyroscopes still drifted. The stabilization platform still required tedious leveling procedures. The device remained complex enough that only highly trained bombardiers could operate it effectively. Norden was making progress, just not fast enough for the Navy's expanding requirements. Theodore Barth entered the picture in 1923. A former Army colonel with a background in chemical warfare, Barth possessed the business skills and diplomatic temperament Norden completely lacked. Where Norden was abrasive and perfectionistic, Barth was pragmatic and promotional. The Navy strongly encouraged Norden to take Barth as a partner, worried that leaving the bombsight development in the hands of one irascible genius was strategically unwise. Norden agreed, reluctantly. In 1928, they formally incorporated as Carl L. Norden, Incorporated, with Barth as president and Norden as chief consulting engineer. Barth would handle manufacturing, contracts, and government relations. Norden would focus exclusively on engineering. Captain Frederick Entwistle, assistant research chief at the Bureau of Ordnance, joined shortly after, contributing both technical expertise and military perspective. All three men shared patent rights. They initially worked out of one floor of a building on Lafayette Street in New York City, with Barth often assembling prototypes in his apartment because they lacked proper manufacturing facilities. In 1929, the Navy awarded them a contract to develop an improved model designated Mark 15. This would be the breakthrough design. Norden and his small team spent 2 years refining every component, better gyroscopes spinning faster and more precisely, improved gimbal mounts that isolated the platform from aircraft vibration, a more sophisticated telescope with greater magnification. Most critically, an analog computer that continuously calculated bomb trajectory based on all current flight conditions and displayed the exact release point. The Mark 15, delivered in summer 1931, represented a quantum leap. Testing from 12,000 feet altitude demonstrated a circular error probable of 35 feet. At higher altitudes, a series of 80 bomb runs averaged 75 feet. For comparison, the production Mark 11 models achieved 55 feet at best. In a demonstration on October 7, 1931, the Mark 15 placed 50% of its bombs directly on the USS Pittsburgh, a stationary target vessel. An aircraft using the older Mark 11 managed only 20% hits. Lieutenant Frederick Entwistle, the Navy's chief of bombsight development, called it revolutionary. The design was good enough that it would remain essentially unchanged through World War II and continue in service until the Vietnam War. The Mark 15 worked because Norden had finally solved the stability problem. The device consisted of 2 primary sections. On the left, a gyroscopic stabilization platform containing 2 gyroscopes spinning at 7,200 revolutions per minute. This platform maintained a perfectly level reference regardless of aircraft movement. On the right, the mechanical calculator and sighting head containing the telescope and analog computer, both sections connected through a precision prism that relayed the bombardier's view of the ground to the calculation mechanisms. Before each mission, the stabilization platform required righting, a time-consuming process because the gyroscopes drifted slowly and no longer pointed true vertical after hours of inactivity. The bombardier would compare the platform's attitude to small spirit levels visible through a glass window on the stabilizer's front face, making minute adjustments until the platform indicated perfectly level. Once righted, he'd dial in mission parameters: altitude from the aircraft's instruments, airspeed, trail, a value representing how the specific bomb type being carried would behave during its fall. These values came from ballistic tables that scientists had painstakingly compiled through live-fire testing. With the bomb sight initialized, the bombardier would clutch out the sighting prism from the computer, allowing him to move it rapidly to search for the target on the ground below. Locating the target was often the hardest part. From 20,000 feet, even large factory complexes appeared as indistinct clusters of buildings. Industrial haze, cloud cover, and the limited magnification of the telescope made identification difficult. The bombardier would reference aerial photographs taken during reconnaissance flights, matching distinctive terrain features like rivers, rail lines, or uniquely shaped buildings. Once he identified the target, the critical phase began. He'd clutch the sighting prism back into the computer, mechanically linking his view to the calculation mechanisms. Then he'd rotate the entire bomb sight left or right until the vertical line in his telescope passed directly through the target. This rotation fed directional information to the computer. As the bomber approached the target, the bombardier's job became maintaining that vertical line on target using two control wheels. One wheel adjusted for crosswind drift. The other corrected for changes in the sight's alignment as the aircraft's heading shifted. These continuous corrections fed data to the analog computer, which calculated the bomb's trajectory dozens of times per second. Inside the calculator, rotating shafts represented mathematical values. Shaft rotation speed equaled aircraft velocity. Shaft angle represented target, bearing. Gears meshed at specific ratios to add, subtract, and multiply these values mechanically, solving differential equations that would take a human calculator several minutes to work through manually. The computer output appeared in the index window, a small display showing the calculated release angle. As the bomber got closer, a sliding indicator in the index window moved toward the release point. When the current position matched the calculated release angle, the bomb sight automatically triggered bomb release. No human reaction time involved. The bombs dropped at the mathematically precise instant the geometry demanded. In testing, this system achieved astounding accuracy for the era. 75 feet circular error probable from altitude meant that bombardiers could theoretically hit specific buildings within large industrial complexes, destroying production capacity while leaving worker housing, schools, and hospitals untouched. Humane precision bombing seemed achievable, but the Mark 15 had one critical limitation that would define its entire operational history. It only worked perfectly under conditions that almost never existed in combat. Clear weather, no clouds obscuring the target, minimal wind shear between altitude and ground level, no enemy fighters forcing the bomber into evasive maneuvers, no anti-aircraft flak requiring the aircraft to fly at 30,000 feet instead of the optimal 20,000, no mechanical failures in the 1,500 precision components that made up the device. Most importantly, it required a bomber flying straight and level on a predictable course for several minutes during the final approach. Every combat reality worked against that requirement. The Norden bombsight could solve complex ballistic equations faster than any human. It couldn't solve the problem of war being fundamentally unpredictable. That gap between test range perfection and combat chaos would define everything that followed. States Army Air Corps first learned about the Navy's revolutionary new bombsight in 1932, when they finally compared notes with their naval counterparts and discovered that Norden's instrument vastly outperformed the Army's competing design developed by the Sperry Corporation. The Army wanted the Norden immediately. There was one problem. Carl Norden regarded the Army as plebeian and wouldn't deal with them. He once told an Army colonel, "No man can serve the Lord and the devil at the same time, and I work for the Navy." The Army's solution was bureaucratically elegant and personally humiliating for Norden. They bought the bombsights from the Navy, who purchased them from Norden. The arrangement satisfied no one, but enabled the Army Air Corps to begin equipping their bomber fleet with the most advanced targeting system in existence. The Army designated their version the M1, later refined into the M series as improvements were incorporated. By 1935, Norden had developed an additional innovation that made the bombsight even more revolutionary. The Stabilized Bombing Approach Equipment, or SBAE, essentially an autopilot that connected directly to the bombsight and the aircraft's control surfaces. During the final bombing run, the bombardier could take complete control of the aircraft. He'd rotate the entire Norden until the vertical line in his telescope passed through the target, then engage the autopilot. From that moment, the bombsight flew the airplane, automatically correcting for crosswinds, maintaining heading, and keeping the aircraft on the precise course geometry demanded. The pilot's only job was maintaining altitude and airspeed. Everything else, the minute adjustments that kept the bomber lined up perfectly on target, happened automatically through electrical signals flowing from the bombsight to the control surfaces. This removed another source of error. Human pilots, no matter how skilled, couldn't maintain absolutely straight and level flight while being shot at. The autopilot didn't care about flak or fighters. It simply executed the mathematical solution with mechanical precision. Testing demonstrated that the SBAE improved accuracy by roughly 15% over manual piloting during bomb runs. By 1939, Norden and Bath were ready to promote their creation. Publicly, they couldn't say much because the device remained classified secret. But within military circles, they made extraordinary claims. Ted Bath, the company's president, told military planners they did not regard a 15-foot square as being a very difficult target to hit from an altitude of 30,000 feet. Think about that claim for a moment. 15 feet square from 30,000 feet. That's not hitting a factory. That's not even hitting a specific building within a factory. That's hitting a specific room. At some point, someone at the Norden Company coined the phrase that would define the bombsight's legend for decades. With this device, a bombardier could drop a bomb into a pickle barrel from 20,000 feet. The claim was technically meaningless. From 20,000 feet, a pickle barrel would be completely invisible through the Norden's telescope. The crosshairs themselves obscured roughly 300 feet of ground at that altitude. You literally couldn't see a target that small, much less hit it. But as propaganda, the phrase was perfect. Concrete, visual, memorable. It suggested capabilities so extraordinary that they bordered on magical. The Norden Company even adopted a Latin motto to reinforce the message. Cuper fiat melior muriae per Norden obibit. Loosely translated, when better pickle barrels are built, Norden will hit them too. By 1940, as war consumed Europe and American involvement looked increasingly likely, military planners were designing the entire strategic bombing doctrine around the Norden's promised capabilities. The Army Air Forces calculated that a B-17 flying fortress equipped with a Norden bombsight had a 1.2% probability of hitting a 100-foot target from 20,000 feet. That meant you'd need 220 bombers for a 93% probability of achieving one or more hits on a specific factory building. Difficult, but achievable. The Air Forces forecast they'd need 251 combat groups, roughly 6,000 heavy bombers, to execute their comprehensive bombing plans against Germany. Everything depended on the Norden performing in combat, exactly as it performed on test ranges. In 1941, as America prepared for war, the security apparatus around the Norden reached almost absurd levels. The device was classified secret, later upgraded to top secret. Every component carried classification markings. Bombardiers selected for training took a formal oath during their first week. Mindful of the secret trust about to be placed in me by my Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, by whose direction I have been chosen for bombardier training, and mindful of the fact that I am to become guardian of one of my country's most priceless military assets, the American bombsight, I do here, in the presence of Almighty God, swear by the Bombardier's Code of Honor to keep inviolate the secrecy of any and all confidential information revealed to me, and further to uphold the honor and integrity of the Army Air Forces, if need be, with my life itself. Serious business. The oath wasn't merely ceremonial. Bombardiers received explicit instructions for what to do if their aircraft crashed behind enemy lines. First, shoot the critical components with your service pistol. If that failed or left the device too intact, use the thermite grenade mounted near the bomb site. The incendiary device generated temperatures hot enough to melt the entire 2,000-piece mechanism into a useless lump of metal. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo, the bomber, which carried Norden bombsights, originally included flotation bags in the wings to help crews survive water ditching. When the Pacific War began, the Navy removed these flotation bags. Better to let the aircraft sink rapidly, taking the Norden with it, than risk Japanese forces recovering an intact bomb site from a floating wreck. Every bomber base maintained a bomb vault, a secure facility manned by armed guards, where bomb sites were stored between missions. These vaults operated like banks, with strict sign-out procedures and constant surveillance. Before each mission, an ordnance technician would retrieve the Norden under armed guard, typically 2 soldiers with loaded weapons, and transport it to the aircraft in a jeep. The bombardier would install the upper section, called the sight head or the football because of its distinctive shape, into the bomber's nose. The lower section, the stabilizer, remained permanently mounted in the aircraft. Even after installation, the bomb site stayed covered with a canvas bag until the aircraft was airborne. Enemy agents or spies watching the airfield couldn't see the device's configuration or details. After landing from a mission, the reverse procedure occurred. The bombardier removed the sight head, covered it, and armed guards transported it back to the bomb vault. Throughout this entire security theatre, the bomb site shop crews performed the most technically demanding maintenance work on any Air Force base. These enlisted men needed extraordinary mechanical aptitude to calibrate and repair devices containing 1,500 precision components. They worked in climate-controlled facilities because temperature variations affected the gyroscope's performance. They maintained detailed logs of every bomb site's service history, tracking which aircraft it flew in, how many missions it completed, and what maintenance procedures were performed. The non-commissioned officer in charge of a bomb site shop held one of the most secret positions in the entire ground crew structure. He and his staff knew exactly how the device worked, which made them potentially valuable targets for enemy intelligence. The entire elaborate security system communicated one message to everyone involved: this device wins wars, protect it at all costs. There was just one problem with the security measures. They were completely pointless. In 1938, 3 years before America entered the war, a German spy named Hermann W. Lang, working at the Carl L. Norden Company, stole the complete technical specifications for the Mark V-15 bombsight. Lang didn't smuggle out documents or photographs. He memorized the designs during his work at the factory, then reconstructed detailed plans from memory during a visit to Germany. German military intelligence paid him $1,500, a pittance for what was supposedly America's most valuable military secret. In 1941, the FBI arrested Lang along with 32 other German agents as part of the Duquesne spy ring, the largest espionage prosecution in U.S. history at that time. Lang received an 18-year sentence on espionage charges. By then, German intelligence had possessed complete information about the Norden bombsight for 3 years. They built their own copy, tested it, analyzed its capabilities and limitations, then made a strategic decision that American intelligence wouldn't fully understand until after the war. The Germans concluded the Norden wasn't worth copying for their operational needs. German air doctrine emphasized dive bombing and tactical ground support rather than high-altitude strategic bombing. The Luftfernrohr 7, Germany's own bombsight, used similar gyroscopic principles but simpler construction. For their purposes, it was good enough. The elaborate American security measures, the oaths, the armed guards, the bomb vaults, all of it secured a secret that Germany already knew and didn't particularly care about. But American military planners didn't know the secret had leaked, so the security theatre continued throughout the war. August 17, 1942. 12 B-17 flying fortresses of the 97th Bombardment Group, escorted by Royal Air Force Spitfires, approached the Sotteville rail yard 3 miles south of Rouen, France. This was it. The first combat mission by American heavy bombers over occupied Europe. The first test of daylight precision bombing doctrine. The first operational use of Norden bombsights against an enemy who was actively shooting back. Brigadier General Ira Eker, commander of the 8th Air Force's bomber operations, flew in one of the B-17 seconds to personally observe the mission. The target wasn't strategically critical. A rail yard in France, heavily defended enough to test the concept but not so vital that failure would devastate campaign plans. The bombers attacked from roughly 15,000 feet. Results were, by the standards of World War I bombing, excellent. They hit the rail yard. Damage was significant. All 12 bombers returned safely. Mission accomplished. Sort of. When intelligence analysts examined reconnaissance photographs taken after the attack, the detailed picture became more complicated. Yes, bombs hit the rail yard. They also hit areas several hundred yards away from the aiming point. The circular error probable looked more like 400 feet than 75 feet. Still better than any previous bombing technology, but nowhere near the precision testing had promised. Over the next several months, as American bomber operations expanded, the gap between expected and actual performance widened. The 8th Air Force bombed targets in France and along the coast where fighter escorts could provide protection. Accuracy varied wildly. Some missions achieved impressive results. Others completely missed their targets. Several factors immediately became apparent. Cloud cover over Europe was far more common than over American test ranges in Arizona or Nevada. When clouds obscured the target, bombardiers couldn't use the Norden's optical system at all. They'd either abort the mission or resort to radar bombing, a much less accurate technique that defeated the entire purpose of daylight precision attacks. Industrial haze and smoke frequently obscured targets even in clear weather. Factories produced smoke, cities generated smog. Bombing raids themselves created smoke and dust that obscured everything. The Norden's telescope couldn't see through obscuration. German anti-aircraft defenses, flak batteries, forced bombers to fly higher than optimal altitude. The ideal bombing altitude for the Norden was around 15,000 to 20,000 feet, where the bombsight could balance accuracy against survivability. But by mid-1943, German flak coverage had become so dense that bombers had to operate between 23,000 and 30,000 feet to reduce losses. At 30,000 feet, even the most skilled bombardier struggled to identify targets through the Norden's telescope. Temperature at altitude created constant mechanical problems. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit wasn't just uncomfortable, it was destructive. Lubricating oils in the bombsight's mechanisms would congeal, causing gyroscopes to slow down and gears to bind. Optical elements would fog. To combat this, the Air Force purchased electrically heated blankets that wrapped around the Norden, maintaining temperature stability. But the blankets drew power from aircraft electrical systems already strained by operating defensive guns, radios, and other equipment. If the heating failed, which happened frequently, the bombsight might not function at the critical moment. German fighter attacks forced bombers into evasive maneuvers that completely negated the Norden's accuracy. The device needed several minutes of straight and level flight during the final approach to calculate proper release angles. But Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters didn't politely wait for bombers to complete their calculations. When fighters attacked, pilots had to maneuver aggressively. Every turn, every altitude change, every acceleration disrupted the bombsight's calculations and forced the bombardier to start over. The complexity of the device created operational problems nobody had anticipated during testing. The Norden contained 2,000 individual parts. Any one of those parts could fail. When something broke, only specially trained technicians in the bombsight shop could repair it. Unlike a jammed gun or a damaged engine, bombardiers couldn't fix Norden malfunctions in flight. If it failed, the mission failed. Equipment failure rates ran surprisingly high. Cold temperatures, vibration from extended flight, battle damage from flak fragments, all contributed to breakdowns. By some estimates, 15 to 20% of Nordens experienced some degree of malfunction during missions. Most importantly, human factors degraded performance in ways testing never revealed. In training, bombardiers practiced on stationary targets under controlled conditions without anyone trying to kill them. In combat, they operated while exhausted, cold, frightened, and under continuous stress. Fear affected fine motor control. The delicate adjustments required on the Norden's control wheels became harder when your hands shook. Oxygen deprivation at high altitude impaired judgment. Even slight hypoxia, enough to make you feel merely tired rather than obviously impaired, slowed reaction times and reduced visual acuity. The cumulative effect of all these factors showed up in the statistics. By 1943, analysts at 8th Air Force Headquarters were compiling detailed accuracy reports. The numbers were damning. The average circular error, probable for bombs, dropped using the Norden over Europe in 1943 measured 1,200 feet. Not 75 feet, as testing demonstrated. 1,200 feet. 16 times worse. Only 16% of bombs dropped fell within 1,000 feet of the aiming point. A 500-pound bomb, standard for precision missions after 1943, had a lethal radius of only 60 to 90 feet. It created a crater 2 feet deep and 9 feet wide. When your accuracy measured in hundreds of feet, and your bombs created damage measured in tens of feet, you weren't conducting precision strikes. You were conducting very expensive area bombardment. The 8th Air Force's report on bombing accuracy for September through December 1944 stated this explicitly. The accuracy of our visual bombing, and probably to some extent of our radar bombing, has been substantially reduced by the necessity of bombing a large proportion of the time at extremely high altitudes. Even with improvements and tactical changes, just 25% of bombs dropped were hitting within 1,000 feet of the aim point. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By fall 1944, only 7% of all bombs dropped by the 8th Air Force hit within 1,000 feet of their aim point. 7%. The Norden bombsight, which had consumed over $1 billion in development and production, which required elaborate security measures and solemn oaths, which promised pickle-barrel accuracy from 20,000 feet, was missing its targets 93% of the time. The British had numbers for comparison. The Royal Air Force, conducting nighttime area bombing with their own Mark 14 bombsight, managed to put only 5% of ordnance within 1 mile of their aiming point. The Americans were doing better, but not by the margin their doctrine required. The RAF had acknowledged reality early in the war and switched from precision bombing to area attacks against cities. They couldn't hit factories reliably, so they hit everything. The Americans insisted on maintaining the fiction of precision. General Ira Eaker, defending the daylight bombing campaign to Prime Minister Winston Churchill at the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, had argued that keeping Germans under attack both day and night, British bombers at night and American bombers by day, would maximize pressure on German war production. Churchill accepted this argument, but only barely. He'd been prepared to pressure President Roosevelt to order American bombers to join the British night campaign. Eaker convinced him to allow the Americans to continue their approach. The cost of that decision was measured in blood. The period from August through October 1943, later called Black Week, saw the 8th Air Force reach crisis point. German fighters and flak were destroying bombers faster than replacements arrived. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the first American bombing mission, the 8th Air Force launched a massive raid against Regensburg and Schweinfurt, 2 cities containing critical ball-bearing factories. The plan was audacious. 376 bombers would strike deep into Germany, hit vital industrial targets with their Norden bombsights, and demonstrate the value of daylight precision bombing. The first bomb wing would hit Regensburg, then continue flying south to land in North Africa instead of returning to England. This shuttle raid concept would confuse German defences. The 4th bomb wing would attack Schweinfurt's ball-bearing plants, which produced critical components for German aircraft and tanks. The reality was catastrophic. German fighters attacked in waves, exploiting the fact that American escort fighters didn't have the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. Without fighter protection, the bomber formations were vulnerable despite their defensive armament. 60 bombers were lost, 60 aircraft, each carrying 10 highly trained crew members, 600 men, either killed or captured. The formations that reached their targets dropped their bombs through clouds, smoke, and heavy flak. Bombing accuracy was terrible. Post-strike reconnaissance showed that while some damage occurred, the ball-bearing plants remained operational. Eaker's report after the mission was brutally honest. Equipment failures, weather, fighter attacks, flak, and the sheer complexity of maintaining formation while under continuous assault had reduced bombing effectiveness to levels far below what doctrine required. 2 months later, the 8th Air Force tried again. October 14, 1943, 291 bombers launched a second raid on Schweinfurt. They lost 60 more bombers. The target, while damaged, continued producing ball bearings. Lieutenant Colonel Bern Ley, one of Eaker's staff officers who flew as an observer on the Regensburg raid, wrote an article for the Saturday Evening Post describing what he witnessed. On we flew through the cluttered wake of a desperate air battle, where disintegrating aircraft were commonplace, and the white dots of 60 parachutes in the air at one time were hardly worth a second look. The spectacle before my eyes became so fantastic that my brain turned numb to the actuality of the death and destruction all around us. The life expectancy of a B-17 inches late 1943 was 11 missions. Bomber crews were required to complete 25 missions before they could go home. The mathematics were clear. Statistically, you wouldn't survive your tour. Similar odds applied to the crews themselves. Of the 250,000 aircrew members who flew bomber missions with the 8th Air Force during the war, 58,000 became casualties. 18,000 killed, 6,500 wounded, 33,500 missing, a 23% casualty rate. For comparison, infantry soldiers in Europe during World War II experienced roughly a 17% casualty rate. Flying bombers was more dangerous than fighting on the ground. And all of this, the losses, the blood, the young men who would never come home, was predicated on the promise that daylight precision bombing with the Norden bombsight could win the war by destroying Germany's industrial capacity. After the second Schweinfurt raid, the 8th Air Force suspended deep penetration missions into Germany. They simply couldn't sustain the losses. The strategic bombing campaign, America's primary contribution to defeating Germany from the air, had effectively stalled. The Norden bombsight worked exactly as designed. The problem wasn't the device. The problem was the doctrine that assumed you could fly heavy bombers deep into heavily defended airspace, maintain formation through fighter attacks and flak, arrive over targets that might be obscured by clouds or smoke, and somehow achieve the kind of precision accuracy that test ranges promised under ideal conditions. The tactical solution came in December 1943 with the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, a long-range escort fighter that could accompany bombers all the way to targets deep in Germany. With fighter protection, bomber losses dropped dramatically. Missions could proceed without formations being torn apart by German fighters, but the accuracy problem remained. Even with fighter escort, bombardiers still struggled to hit targets through clouds. Flak still forced bombers to fly at extremely high altitudes. The Norden still couldn't deliver on its promise of precision. So the Air Force adapted its tactics. Instead of individual bombardiers in each aircraft attempting to hit targets independently, they developed the lead bomber concept. Each formation would have one aircraft with the most experienced bombardier. That lead bombardier would do all the target identification and bomb aiming using his Norden bombsight. When his bombs released, every other aircraft in the formation would drop simultaneously. This improved accuracy slightly by ensuring all bombs fell in a concentrated pattern, but it also meant the success of an entire formation depended on one bombardier's skill and one Norden bombsight's performance. If the lead bombardier missed, everyone missed. The Air Force also began accepting that true precision bombing wasn't achievable most of the time. They increased formation sizes, putting up missions with 500, 700, eventually over 1,000 bombers, attacking single-target areas. The sheer tonnage of explosives dropped meant that even with poor accuracy, something useful would get hit. This was area bombing by another name. The British had been doing it at night since 1940. The Americans were now doing it by day while still claiming to practice precision doctrine. The American public never learned about this gap between promise and reality. Security classifications remained in place throughout the war. The Norden Company, once secrecy was partially reduced in 1943 and 1944, aggressively promoted their bombsights capabilities. They even rented Madison Square Garden and staged a demonstration between Ringling Brothers circus performances. The show involved dropping a wooden bomb into an actual pickle barrel, at which point a pickle popped out. Audiences loved it. The demonstration had nothing to do with combat reality, but it reinforced the legend. American strategic bombing, for all its costs and limitations, did achieve significant results by war's end. The sheer scale of the campaign forced Germany to divert massive resources to air defense. Flak batteries that could have been used as anti-tank guns on the Eastern Front instead pointed at the sky over German cities. Fighter aircraft that might have supported ground operations were consumed in defensive battles against bomber formations. The production of German aircraft, tanks, and war materials was disrupted, though never to the degree that strategic bombing doctrine predicted. Importantly, the bombing campaign drew the Luftwaffe into battles of attrition that America could win through industrial production. Germany couldn't replace losses fast enough. By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe was effectively defeated as a fighting force, which enabled the D-Day invasion to proceed without significant air opposition. The Norden bombsight contributed to this outcome, but not in the way anyone expected. Its value wasn't precision. Its value was enabling daylight operations that, combined with British night raids, kept Germany under constant aerial assault. The device worked well enough to justify the doctrine, even if it never worked as perfectly as the doctrine required. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, Norden bombsights guided the B-29 superfortresses Enola Gay and Bockscar to their targets over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The atomic bombs they carried were so powerful that precision accuracy wasn't required. The shockwave and radiation would devastate anything within a mile radius of the detonation point. But bombardiers Thomas Ferriby and Kermit Beahan still used their Norden bombsights to aim. Years of training and doctrine demanded it. Ferriby later reported his bomb on Hiroshima landed within 800 feet of the intended aiming point, the Ioi Bridge. Beahan's bomb on Nagasaki, dropped through cloud cover, landed roughly 1,500 feet from the planned target. Both strikes achieved their strategic purpose regardless of precision. The war ended. After 1945, the Norden saw declining use as radar-based bombing systems, and eventually guided missiles made mechanical bombsights obsolete. During the Korean War, B-29 seconds still equipped with Norden bombsights flew missions against North Korean targets. Vietnam saw the last combat use, when Navy VO-67 Squadron used Nordens to drop sensors along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in 1967. By then, the devices were museum pieces, maintained by retired World War II technicians who had to be called back to service because nobody else knew how to operate them. Today, Norden bombsights sit in museums and private collections. The National Air and Space Museum displays the bombsight from the Enola Gay. The Computer History Museum in California preserves several examples. Collectors sometimes find them at military surplus sales, though most optics and critical components were removed before sale. They're beautiful devices in their own way. Precision machined brass gears, carefully ground optical elements, gyroscopes balanced to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, 2,000 parts working together to solve differential equations mechanically. For 1941, they represented the absolute cutting edge of analog computing. The Norden bombsight didn't win the war. That claim was always propaganda. Wars are won by soldiers, resources, industrial production, and the willingness of entire nations to endure suffering until victory comes. But the Norden did enable a specific kind of warfare that America committed to, despite enormous costs. Daylight strategic bombing doctrine required a device that could theoretically hit precise targets from altitude. The Norden was that device, even if reality never matched theory. What's fascinating isn't that the bombsight failed to achieve its promised accuracy. It's that American strategic planners bet everything on a technology that couldn't possibly deliver what doctrine demanded, then stuck with that approach despite mounting evidence of its limitations. Why? Partly because admitting failure would mean acknowledging that thousands of aircrews died pursuing an unachievable goal. Partly because the alternatives, switching to British-style nighttime area bombing or accepting that strategic air power had limits, were politically and doctrinally unacceptable. And partly because the Norden worked just well enough, not precisely, not reliably, but well enough that when combined with overwhelming industrial production and brave crews willing to fly into hell repeatedly, it contributed to victory. The legend of the pickle barrel persists because legends serve purposes that facts don't. The legend says American technology gave us clean, precise, almost surgical warfare. The facts say warfare is never clean, precision is relative, and surgical strikes require conditions that rarely exist in combat. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.